Well, good afternoon on a Wednesday. We want to have another chance to study together for a little while from the Gospel of Matthew. And for the last couple of weeks, we've looked at Matthew chapter 23. This was the chapter where Jesus sort of went on the offensive in dealing with the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. He exposed the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and even the office of the chief priests, to expose them for the greedy, self-seeking people that they really were. Of course, this absolutely infuriated the Jewish leadership. But Jesus was right there to deal with them, for after all, in the previous chapters in Matthew, they had been asking him all kinds of loaded questions to try and trap him into saying something that would put him at odds with the Romans, or something that would put him in opposition to the feelings of many of the people that would have been in his audience. But in each case, he answered their questions perfectly, and he was able to turn those questions back on them. Even when they challenged his authority, he had a way to answer that question that helped highlight the fact that they were not doing the things that they should be doing if they truly wanted to follow as servants of God. At the ending of the chapter, Jesus laments the fact that this has been characteristic of Jerusalem down through the years. There had been so many prophets sent to them, and they had mistreated them, they had ignored them, they had continued to practice their evil ways, and as a result of this, God's patience had run out, and there was now going to be a day of reckoning for this Jewish nation. Now, as we move into the beginning of the 24th chapter, we find that Jesus now leaves the temple proper area, and he and the apostles begin to explore a little bit more on the Temple Mount, and are able to observe the great restoration and expansion projects that the Herods had put in place over the last 40 or 50 years. And notice what happens. In verse 1 of Matthew 24, it says, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. That would have been a stunning prophecy to these apostles. For these buildings were fabulous, much like we might think of the memorials and the major and impressive buildings that we would see in Washington, D.C. And so here are all of these fabulous surroundings that they're looking at, and Jesus said it's all going to be destroyed. These lowly fishermen, by and large, from Galilee, were not accustomed to having so many glorious buildings, and to think of Jerusalem being destroyed, this was something that truly gave them reason to pause. Well, later, apparently that evening, I would suppose, they were out on the Mount of Olives, and they asked Jesus for some more clarification on this. Continuing in verse 3, it says, And as they sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? This is certainly a puzzle to these apostles. And the way that they kind of equated all of this together was that if Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, then certainly to them that was going to be the ending of the world. And Jesus, through his parables, had frequently talked about his coming back again. So is all this going to happen at one time? And what are going to be the signs to let us know that this is coming? Well, Jesus sees their confusion, and it's understandable, because so many of the Jewish teachers had been showing for some time now that the Messiah was just going to establish some kind of physical kingdom, restore the kingdom to like David had it years before. In fact, the apostles so bought into that even as Jesus was getting ready to ascend back to his Father in Acts chapter 1, they asked him, Wilt thou at this time deliver the kingdom back to Israel? And so Jesus here is going to help them understand a little bit more about this, but it will not come to our full understanding until the Holy Spirit helps them with it a little bit later on. But Jesus dissects the multiple questions that they're asking here. There's really two big questions. Number one, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And then number two, what will the second coming and the end of the world, when is that going to occur? And so Jesus begins to give them some understandings about what was going to come to pass. Continuing in verse 4, Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." There's going to be a lot of folks who are going to pretend to be the promised Messiah, and they're going to try to draw a following after them. He had been extremely successful with that and had the evidence to prove his divinity with the miracles that he performed. And so through deception, there would be others who would try to say that they were the Christ. And many, unfortunately, would fall prey to their trickery. But Jesus continues in verse 6. He said, "Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. And see that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet." There's going to be wars going on. There are going to be conflicts that are going to be observed. But these are not telling you that this is going to be the ending of Jerusalem. This is kind of the normal unfolding of things. He says in the next verse, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places." All of these are just the beginnings of sorrows. He said this is going to be an unfolding of events, and it's going to be pretty much life as usual, but the end, that day of sorrows, is indeed coming. And then he turns the focus on what was going to happen to them. In verse 9, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another." Even amongst the Christians, there was going to be divisions, and there would be families that would be split, with some that would have an allegiance to Christ, and others still believing the old line of the Jews that he was some kind of impostor. And so there was going to be friction and conflict that ran very deep into the Jewish family. He said, "And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many." There are going to be many teachers who step forward thinking if they have the answers. We are prophets of God. Remember, there's been like 400 years of silence here until John the Baptist came and Jesus came. And so now there are going to be other imposters, false Christs, false prophets, who are going to try to capture the attention of people and try to lead their religious thinking. He says, "And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." Many folks are just going to get fed up with the whole mess because of the conflicting things that are being taught and the deceptions that will be in evidence. "But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved." Here Jesus is referencing those of his true disciples who will believe in him and who will remain faithful unto him, even though there is going to be a lot of risk involved and there's going to be a lot of confusion going on around them. And this gospel of the kingdom, this good news of Jesus Christ, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. The destruction of Jerusalem is not going to occur until there has been a time span there for the apostles to do their work. The apostle Paul told the Colossians that the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. The Great Commission was fulfilled, and all of this occurred before Jerusalem was sacked and burned. But then Jesus begins to focus again upon this actual desolation of Jerusalem. In verse 15, he said, "And when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolations spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." Daniel had given a prophecy about even the ending of the national Jewish religion, the destruction of Jerusalem. And over in Daniel chapter 9 and going down to verse 27, he said, "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation and the determined shall be poured out upon the desolate." This abomination of desolation that he's talking about would be when the Jewish religion was upended, which the Romans did. They forbid the use of the temple for its sacred purposes, and before the destruction of Jerusalem, they erected a mighty altar right in the temple to one of their pagan gods. This is the abomination of desolations that Daniel was predicting was going to come. And Jesus makes reference to it here. Whenever you see that, remember what Daniel said about this being close to the ending of time for the city of Jerusalem. He said, "Let them which be in Judea flee unto the mountains." There's going to be a need for you to be ready and aware and anxious to escape whenever problems were going to come. Going back to that idea of the abomination of desolations over in Luke chapter 21, going down to verses 20 and 21, it says Jesus is repeating the same instruction, and this is Luke's accounting of it. "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter there into it." Jesus is saying, when you start seeing these things happen, when you hear of the Roman armies coming, don't wait around. Whenever you see this gross destruction there in the city of Jerusalem of the Jewish religion, understand that the end is coming, and you are to flee. "Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field turn back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, never ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto thee, Lo, here is Christ, or lo, there, believe it not." Now Jesus says a whole lot here in these next few verses. Whenever you hear of the Roman armies coming, whenever you see this idol erected in the temple of God, simply get out of there. And it may be a very difficult time. You hope that it doesn't happen in the winter. Hope that you don't have the hardships of nursing a baby or something like that. Oftentimes people might be reluctant to flee because it was the Sabbath day and the law restricted travel on the Sabbath day. But he said, you need to understand your need to get out, because the desolation of this city is going to be unbelievable. It's going to be so much greater than what you've ever imagined. It's never been, nor shall it be again, to see this kind of magnitude of slaughter and destruction, as is what's going to soon come to pass. But there'll be some who will set themselves up as if they are the Christ. They're the deliverers. They're the anointed one. We're going to establish a new kingdom. We're going to beat the Romans. Jesus said, don't believe these false claims of people saying that they're the anointed leaders that are going to bring deliverance. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I've told you before. Or in other words, I've warned you. Be careful. There's going to be a lot of folks who are going to exploit this for their own benefit. They're going to try to manipulate you. He says, wherefore, if they say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. It's unimaginable the deceptions and the terrible things that did happen in Jerusalem as that city fell. Whenever we look at the historical references to this and kind of intersect it at this point, we find that about 67 A.D., Vespasian and his son Titus, two mighty Roman generals, understood that the rebellion in and around Jerusalem was never ending. The local Roman authorities were losing control, and they brought about 4 of the great legions of the Roman army down upon Jerusalem to put an end to this once and for all. By about 69 A.D., they were working their way slowly. They were destroying city after city, taking things in charge and in hand, and bringing peace to the nation. And now they approach right up to the gates of Jerusalem. But then in 69 AD, for some reason that at first seemed strange, the Roman army withdrew. What happened was that the emperor in Rome had died, and Vespasian was now named as the new emperor of the Roman Empire. So the Roman army withdrew for a short span of time, and then Titus brought those armies back. And when he came back then in 70 AD, beginning about this time of the year, the ending of March of 70 AD, he focused in on the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. So there was a relatively small window there for people to pack up and get out to save their lives as the Romans were going to come back. And so as Jesus says here, there will be some saying, well, don't worry about it. Even though the Romans might come back, we're still going to whip them. In fact, history tells us that there was a sect of the Jews called the Sicarii, and they had been often used as assassins by high priests and political leaders, but they were dead set against defeating the Romans, and they did not want the Jews in any manner to submit or to surrender to them. And so history tells us that they actually collected and burned the food that Jerusalem had in storage. That way, whenever the Romans offered siege to the city, they couldn't just sit back and wait out the siege and eventually hope that the Romans got tired, they could negotiate some kind of settlement and surrender, and the Romans would go away. No, the Sicarii wanted the fight. That's just how devious some in the Jewish community were and how self-serving they thought they were with their nationalistic fervor. And so they burned the food storage in Jerusalem so that the people would see there's a sense of urgency. We've got to fight these Romans, and we've got to defeat them. Like Jesus is saying, there's some folks here who's going to think they have the answer. Here is our Savior. Here is what we need to do. But they are dead wrong in their plans. He said, for as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. He said, don't pretend that these guys are somehow going to be leading you. The Lord's going to come and give you some big victory. And the Lord's not going to come back and be hiding in a secret chamber someplace. When the Lord returns, every eye shall see him, every knee shall bow, we are taught in other passages. And so Jesus is helping these apostles to understand that these false notions are going to be circulating, and they would need to warn the Christians to not even listen to this kind of garbage. He says, for wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. The insignia of the Romans was an eagle. And as those eagles gathered together, as the centurions of soldiers began to gather together, and the legions came down upon Jerusalem, there were going to be carcasses, and there were going to be a lot of them. Tacitus tells us that there were probably about 600,000 people trapped in Jerusalem when the Roman armies came. Josephus puts the number even higher. He claims it was something near 1 million people who were trapped in Jerusalem whenever those armies of Romans came back for their destructive work. We find in verse 29, continuing here of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus says, immediately after this tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. That same terminology is used in talking about many great destructions or fallings of empires. In Isaiah 13 and verse 10, that phrasing is used to talk about the fall of Babylon. In Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 7 and 8, that same phraseology is used to describe the fall of Egypt to its adversaries. So this is the way of the Bible saying that a great power that had shown light and shown leadership eventually is darkened. Their candle kind of goes out because of their falling victim to opposing forces. In verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and glory. This is going to be the coming of the Lord's judgment. It's not Jesus coming back to judge the world. It's not his coming back to judge mankind and to see the earth burned up. But it's the coming of God's judgment. The book of Revelation uses that same kind of terminology, that a judgment day comes. And it's not the final judgment. It is just the rendering of God's judgment upon a particular group of people. Over in Matthew chapter 26 and going down to verse 64, we find here that Jesus is talking to the high priest. He says, "Thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And this just sent the high priest into orbit. That phrasing is not to be taken literal, that you're literally going to see me sitting on a throne, but you're going to feel my judgment. You are going to see what is decreed from the throne of God, and you will see that the things I'm saying are going to come to pass. "And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." And here again, this is where some folks want to say, oh, this is the rapture. This is the rapture, the righteous being taken up. The rapture doesn't have anything to do with this. It's not even mentioned in the pages of Scripture. This isn't some sign of a rapture taking place or the promise of any such. But rather, in conjunction with the previous verse, the Lord is saying God's judgment is going to be visited upon this sinful nation, and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And the elect are being warned. The elect are going to have the option to get out of town before this all comes to pass. God's working to preserve and to save them because the warnings are being given for them to see. In verse 32, Jesus said, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that the summer is nigh." Like we're looking around right now, and we're seeing the leaves come out in bloom. The blooms on various plants of the outside. And so we know spring is coming. We've reached that time of the year. Jesus said, now think about that. You see the signs, and you know spring is coming. In verse 33, "So likewise ye, when ye shall see all of these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." What is near? The destruction of the city of Jerusalem. That's what he's been talking about through all of these earlier verses. And to clinch that, let's look at verse 34. "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." Everything that we've read about in these first verses of Matthew chapter 24 have all been time-stamped to be things that were going to happen previous to the great destruction of Jerusalem. And that destruction took place in AD 70. The signs unfolded just as Jesus had predicted. So Jesus answers this question about when is the temple going to be destroyed? When is Jerusalem going to, shall we say, go up in smoke? Now in the remaining part of the chapter, which we'll look at next time, is we'll talk about those things that he asks in that second set of questions. When will the end of time come? And when will the coming of the Son of Man be? And Jesus will give them instruction relative to that as well. Well, thank you for studying with me this afternoon. Hope that it's been beneficial to you. Matthew 24 is a confusing chapter to many people. We're studying it in the radio program on Sunday mornings for 15 minutes, but I wanted to go through it and kind of dig a little deeper in the time that we had together, and I hope you've enjoyed the study today. Thank you so much for joining us.